Hello everyone. I know it's always a mistake to begin anything with an apology, but I have to tell you that Rory is not going to be with you today. Um, and I have to tell you the real reason is, and I warned him at the time, that he got married. So if you get married, Rory, forget it. You're going to be in trouble. So he has a family crisis, not a crisis, a requirement, which if he does not fulfil, he will be hung, drawn and quartered ceremonially in some public place. So instead I've persuaded him to do a little video which will give you an insight into the way he looks at things, which is a frightening thought. But more importantly, will make you think and possibly re-evaluate your assumptions about how brands are built, because they really aren't built the way what they used to be. So Rory's going to talk to you now for a little bit, and I think you'll find him extremely fascinating, extremely interesting, and contrarian is the word we use now for somebody in investment who goes against the tide. I recommend going against the tide. It's done quite well for me.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to speak for Drayton, and it's always a pleasure to be billed as a contrarian too. The one caveat I make as a contrarian is that a few of the things I tell you will almost certainly be wrong, and that's true of contrarians in general. So I apologise for that, and I ask you not to sue me in 5 years' time. On the other hand, I also don't apologise for it, because I think the risk of occasionally being wrong about things is a price worth paying for looking at things in a different way. And sometimes actually looking at things in completely the wrong way can still pay dividends, simply because actually it gives you a fresh approach on something which takes you somewhere you weren't expecting. To some extent in marketing, the task is to be different and differentiated rather than to be right. And so a contrarian viewpoint sort of pays off more in this field than it does in most places. So a few examples. The first caveat I'd make is your problem a brand problem at all? And that's an important point to make, because as the world gets richer, the categories in which we spend our money, not just the brands, become slightly more discretionary than they were. Broadly speaking, in 1950s marketing, people by and large wanted the same things, and it was just a question of what brand of thing you chose. As the world gets a bit richer, actually what happens is people start to make decisions at the category level, not just the brand level. So if I were, for example, the brand manager or in charge with selling rum in the UK, my big question would not be how strong is my individual brand, Captain Morgan or whatever, but my question would be actually, let's look at the competitor set, and the competitor set's probably wine. By which I mean there are probably, 1 million people last weekend who are actually inviting people to drinks or having drinks themselves, and they ask themselves the simple question, red or white. They didn't ask the question, red or white or rum. So there are cases where actually if your category isn't even being considered, then your brand strength within that category is irrelevant. So don't always make the mistake which I think advertising often makes, which is to say the answer's brand, now what's the question? Quite a lot of the time, the answer may be something else. One of the most beautiful examples of this was actually, I think it was an account person working on the Sainsbury's pitch when AMV were re-pitching for Sainsbury's last time. And they were given a brief which was they had to increase sales over a 5-year period by so many £billion. And they sat around going, well, to be absolutely honest, I don't think a brand transformation on its own is actually going to achieve this. And it was a fairly junior account person who came into the room and said, I've done a bit of maths, and actually, if you divide the several £billion they want sales to increase by the number of store visits over that period, it equates to about £1.27 per visit. So effectively, if we can just get everybody to buy one extra thing on every visit, we've actually fulfilled our task. So that's how actually the answer came about, which was try something new today. And actually, as a brilliant byproduct, it was a great brand idea as well as being a great business idea. So that's the first caveat. Don't necessarily start with brand as if it's the only lever you've got to pull, because actually it isn't. The second thing I'd say as a contrarian is don't necessarily assume that brand preference works the way you think it does, or indeed that preference has to exist at all. And what I'm not saying here is that brands are unimportant. Brands are hugely important, and their principal value actually is that basically people will pay quite a lot more for branded things than they will for unbranded things, or things that are unknown or obscure. Nothing's completely without brand value, but basically famous brands and well-known brands and advertised brands command a premium in the marketplace. They don't necessarily work by actually giving you massive rational reasons to be preferred over your competitors. It may simply be a question of just fame. I'll explain a bit of that a little later, but I was sent a questionnaire by some people in Ogilvy who are pitching for some area of business, and the question was this. It said, what is your favourite coffee chain out of the following three? Starbucks, Costa Coffee, and Caffè Nero, I think was the third one. Now, as a classicist, I do find Caffè Nero slightly disappointing, because the whole sort of Nero theme, they don't live up to that at all. You know, there's no torture, there are no Christians being attacked by animals. Very, very disappointing in that respect. But leaving that aside for a second, actually, there's a really important question to ask, which is, why does the consumer need to have a favourite? Now, what the consumer probably does have is they have a mental repertoire of coffee shops they're happy to go into and coffee shops they don't. But you don't actually need, in order to function as a human being, and people are basically problem-solving animals. They solve problems, when they come to them. I don't actually need to have a favourite. You might actually pretend to dislike Starbucks because it's American if you want to chat up left-wing girls or something like that, okay? But by and large, you don't actually need to rank those things in an order 1, 2, 3. Because actually, when it comes to the thing, one might be closer to you, one might be crowded, one might be relatively empty, a particular local one might be rubbish. We don't actually need to rank brands 1, 2, 3 in order of preference. You might do. It's not saying it's impossible. But to some extent, that's something that conventional market research sort of forces people to do. It says, okay, where do what's your favourite brand of coffee shop? And the person will come up with an answer. I said that to some extent market research forces people to actually express things like preferences or that they don't really feel. And that's simply because we feel when we're presented with a researcher and he asks the question, what we'll probably say is actually, we'll think which coffee shop we go to most often and we'll call that our favourite. It may not be our favourite brand in truth, we've just post-rationalised it as our favourite because we go there most often. That's another really useful thing in marketing which is worth knowing, which is quite often attitudinal change follows behavioural change. It doesn't actually necessarily precede it. And that's actually something that is very much worth knowing as a direct marketer. If you make it very easy for people to buy your product, they'll buy it more, and as a result of buying it more, they'll decide to like it. People, broadly speaking, like to make sense of their lives, and if they mostly buy a toothpaste, they'll say it's their favourite toothpaste. Now, the reason it's their favourite toothpaste may not be actually because they fell in love with it, it became a love mark, they decided to be 100% loyal to that toothpaste. It's simply because when we buy something a lot, we decide to like it, to make sense of our lives. It's the great phrase, to be brutal about it, she's pretty because I married her, rather than the reverse. So actually, quite a lot of the human brain works in reverse order to the order we think it works. So one of the really boring things, as I said, it's not all brand, is one of the most important things you can do is make your product really easy to buy. Now, I know that sounds completely banal, but what I'm saying is it's almost impossible to overstate how important it is. And so that's, quite a lot of brand preference actually emerges from purchase behaviour. So one of the things is, if you have a catalogue, banal but absolutely true, put the telephone number on every single page of the catalogue. Give people 5 different means of ordering. Let them order by text, let them order by iPad application, because even tiny little things about channel preference seem to have a huge effect on behaviour. And this is borne out actually by a very interesting book, which is also a contrarian book on brands, called How Brands Grow, by a guy called Byron Sharp, who's a New Zealander at the University of Adelaide, I think. Published by Oxford University Press, and one of the things this says is that actually people basically aren't loyal to brands. They're kind of brand Mormons. They have a repertoire of 2 or 3 acceptable brands, and they buy more or less of these brands from time to time according to simple physical availability is probably the first thing. you can't overstate the importance of just distribution, but also mental availability. And one of the things that seems to emerge time and time again is just those brands which advertise the most, almost regardless of what they say. Now this is the bit that seems a bit confusing. If you think about it, you probably have more arguments about what your advertising says than how much you should advertise. But one of the things that's vital is that if your brand is simply famous and memorable and distinctive and advertises quite a lot, you will sell more. Very simple reason for that. As I said, one of the important things to understand is people don't necessarily choose brands from the top down. They're not looking at brands to say, what is the single best thing I can buy with my £2.29? Okay? That would be the activity of a maximizer, to use one technical term. Some categories, some of the time, by some people, are probably shot that way. If you're a hi-fi nut, you buy hi-fi that way. I've got a budget of £4,000, I'm going to spend £100 per foot on speaker cables hand-woven by elves. You know, that kind of stuff does go on. If you're a really keen biker, you probably buy your motorbike that way, which is what is the very best bike I can buy for, you know, 4,000 quid, and you might read what bike for sort of 6 months beforehand and absolutely optimise your purchase. Now the simple truth remains that only a minority of purchases by a minority of people happen that way. I mean, there are certain categories, weddings, anything to do with a wedding, you have to at least pretend to be a maximiser. You can't say to your future wife, can we just get the plastic flowers? Because the whole point is a wedding is about proof of commitment, and therefore you must show an absence of compromise in everything you do, which is why everybody doing anything to do with weddings makes a bloody fortune. Basically, you can actually add about 200% to any goods if they're being sold for a wedding. That's because people act as a kind of maximizer, not as a satisficer. Most decisions, most of the time, we don't have the mental energy or the mental resources or the available information, or frankly the inclination, to make most purchase decisions from what is the best possible shampoo I can buy for £2.49. And because of a peculiarity of human psychology, which is called loss aversion, which is that actually we fear bad things twice as keenly as we hope for good things, the main consideration when we come to make a purchase is, how can I be sure this thing isn't shit, basically. So the main consideration, if you're buying a flat screen TV or whatever, we're looking for some sort of indicator that the thing isn't terrible. We're not looking for the fact that, you know, it is 5% better than a corresponding shampoo that costs 3% less. We're not doing that kind of maths. What we want to do is something that's pretty good, that's not rubbish. And that's what we pay the premium for. And actually, the very fact that the thing is advertised and famous and you've heard of it a lot, coupled incidentally possibly with some new media things that are coming along, like social media, social proof, word of mouth. That's not going to happen much in the shampoo category unless you come up with a shampoo that's utterly miraculous and amazing. But it will happen in categories like hotels and villa hire and things like that. Coupled with things like social proof, provide you with that reassurance that the thing is, you know, is actually pretty good. Now, that's one of the great roles of advertising, that if your product was actually terrible, it's unlikely that you'd actually invest money in advertising it up front. By spending money on advertising, it's proof of your faith in, your belief in what you make, and your commitment to the category in which you operate. But understanding that people often use brands actually in reverse, you know, they actually use them by elimination rather than they do by selection, is really important. Because if you don't understand that, you may actually undervalue the importance of your advertising. So let's imagine someone buying a flat screen TV now, and let's say they're planning to spend about £900. The conventional brand assumption is you spend ages agonising about the very best television you can possibly buy, and some people will indeed do that. And some of the time, maybe the first time you buy a flat screen TV, you're particularly likely to do that kind of thing. Subsequent occasions, what you'll basically do is you will realise that there are unbranded flat screen TVs that are quite a bit cheaper than the branded ones. But actually, at the moment you hand over your credit card, your principal emotion you experience will be one of sheer terror that you might be spending several £100s on something that's rubbish. Now, here's a vital thing to understand, which is most transactions we make involve a large amount of asymmetry. We simply don't know how good a television is until we've owned it for 3 years. We don't know how good a pension is until we've had it for about 40 years. Quite a lot of the things we actually buy or invest in, actually their real value, whether we made a good or bad decision, doesn't become apparent for months, years, in many cases decades. So one of the things we're looking for actually there is, what are the cues we can use to make sure that what we're investing in isn't rubbish? And a brand is a reasonably good clue that actually here is something you can have faith in. The fact that they use mass media suggests that quite a lot of people buy this product, which in itself suggests it's probably reasonably good. The fact that they're prepared to put money behind their reputation means that they have something to lose by selling you something rubbish. And this is what Byron Sharp calls the brand as bond theory. That by investing in a brand, you're almost actually creating a bond, which is something which, to some extent, is something you would lose if you were to actually engage in, either selling poor quality things or unethical behaviour. And so, to an extent, a brand is almost like an open wound, that actually keeps a business honest. And so the fact that people actually pay a premium in that moment of terror, they actually pay £200 or £300 more for the LG or the Panasonic than they do for the Bush, is actually not an irrational thing at all. It's based on a deep human instinct about reputation and about trust. There's a very interesting thing in The Economist recently which shows that people give twice as much money to charity collectors if they're wearing a Lacoste t-shirt or a Hilfiger t-shirt than they do if they're giving to people who either have an unbranded t-shirt or a t-shirt with a crap brand on it. Now, that's actually quite interesting, but I would argue there's nothing actually irrational about that. The reason being, try a thought experiment in reverse. If someone came up to you shaking a tin of money in one hand, and in the other hand they basically had a half-empty bottle of vodka, and they were completely unkempt and swearing a bit, okay? I'm fairly confident to say you wouldn't give them much money, because you say, I don't have much confidence that that money will actually make it to the charity. To some extent, having a Lacoste t-shirt is a visible display of a couple of things. It says you've got some money to spare, which, cruel but true, means you're more likely to be trusted. Not a nice thing to say, but there's a fairly strong human instinct that says, actually, people who are desperate, you can't completely trust. And unfortunately, that's right. It's why actually crack addicts and so forth are very bad people to do business with. Why? Because if you ever give them, entrust them with any money at all, it doesn't matter whether you're their best mates for 20 years, they'll go and spend it on crack, okay? Just a small word of investment, don't go into business with crack addicts, okay? Because, and broadly speaking, people who have some form of desperation, they're hungry or addicted or whatever, aren't great people to do business with. Because their addiction, which is a short-term need, overcomes other long-term considerations like trustworthiness and reputation. So your Lacoste t-shirt actually says, you care about your reputation, you've got a reasonable degree of conscientiousness, and you care about your appearance, which is a fairly good signal of someone who might be more trustworthy than someone who doesn't. So a lot of these things, the way in which brands work in terms of basically conferring trust on the products we buy, often in a case where our actual knowledge about the products we buy is very, very limited. There's a huge kind of asymmetry between what we know about the product and what the person selling it knows. That's also a really, really interesting way of looking at brands. Now, the IPA in analysis of all their advertising effectiveness studies has shown that the single biggest return on advertising investment comes through being able to charge a price premium. That's actually a more effective way to use advertising than trying to gain market share, or the usual sort of conventional things or just trying to increase sales. The interesting thing is that is the thing which is least often briefed, and it's the thing that's least often measured. So the interesting thing is the most effective role of advertising is the thing we rarely ask it to do, and when it does do it, we don't actually measure it. So there's some really interesting things there. Second thing being that actually brands, arguably, and Ehrenberg and people, bear that out. They're quite often just built behaviourally, as I said. We will actually, exhibit more brand preference and more favourable views towards those brands we buy most often. And there's a kind of unfailing law there that basically says, when we buy things a lot, we decide to like them and imbue them with all sorts of favourable attitudes. She's pretty because I married her, broadly speaking. That's a really important thing. Don't necessarily assume that attitudinal change is a necessary or sufficient precursor to behavioural change. Maybe you should try and solve the problem backwards. And this is what I always liked about direct marketing, actually. Direct marketing built brands by actually encouraging people to use the brands. I have an interesting view of things like sales promotion. I think one of the things we've done there is I think people in advertising have completely wrongly dissed sales promotion as a category, whereas it seems evident to me that you can use promotion in a very brand true way that really, really builds brand, and you can use promotion in a way that absolutely damages it. You can do the kind of offers which just encourage people to buy on price, which is deeply damaging to brand value, but equally you can do things like Amazon Prime, which is you create a club where you pay £35 a year and then you get free next day delivery from Amazon. Well, the interesting thing about that is actually it increases sales a lot, but it also increases my affection to Amazon by giving me an offer which makes me feel part of an exclusive club and by making me buy a lot from Amazon. So one of the things I think we made is we dissed all sales promotion activity as if it were all the same thing. I don't think that's true at all. So quite often, the way to actually change behaviour is actually to make a new behaviour easy to adopt. So those are a few kind of ways of looking at it. But what you've got to do is basically any time someone poses you a brand question, don't go in with the assumptions that one, attitude is the necessary and sufficient precursor of behaviour. This is a terribly dangerous belief which nearly everybody holds, not ridiculously, but they nonetheless hold it, which is that, for example, in order to get people to adopt environmentally friendly behaviour, I must turn everybody into a passionate environmentalist just like me. So in other words, people who are keen environmentalists and who are absolutely obsessed with this kind of thing believe that the only way to make the world more environmentally friendly is to make everybody just like them. The problem is that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. It's possibly impossible. It's also incredibly inefficient. To some extent, if you want people to behave in an environmentally friendly way, make it easy for them to recycle. Make recycling stylish or pleasant. There may be 100 different ways in which you can actually change the behaviour of the UK in more environmental ways, which don't require people to become passionate environmentalists at all. My joke suggestion is just legalise cannabis. It'll mean that economic activity will drop by about 20%, no one will fly overseas because they won't be bothered to find their passport, and also BP and Shell will make so much money selling chocolate from late night forecourts they can get out of the oil business. Now that's only flippant, but it's only half flippant. What I'm saying is there are lots and lots of ways of actually changing behaviour which don't require you to change attitude first. So one of the vital things about direct marketing, and one of the great lessons, is just make it, the principal role of direct marketing is, to be absolutely honest, before its job of persuading, the job is to make it very easy for people to buy whatever it is you sell. And, direct marketing is, I think, a channel first and a communications form second, in many ways. The other thing is, very, very boring, in fact, the more channels you operate in, the more you'll sell. Now, a conventional assumption is every time I introduce a new channel, all I'm doing basically is cannibalising business that would have, people who would have bought in an existing channel, and I'm just spending a load of money enabling people to buy what they would have bought anyway in a different way. Doesn't work like that. Oddly, if you want an extreme demonstration of that, go to a railway station and watch the people. Sometimes you'll have a huge queue at the ticket window and no one using the machines, and sometimes you'll have a huge queue at the machines and nobody using the ticket window. We have weird preferences for how we interact. In Japan, most shops have vending machines outside which sell exactly the same thing the shops do, The shops may be open 24 hours a day, but what the Japanese have discovered is if you have a shop and a vending machine selling the same thing, you sell quite a bit more than you do if you only sell it through one form. So that sort of stuff is really, really vital stuff. The next thing is understand the role. The final thing is understand, as I said, it's not all about brand. Understand the role that brand plays in the decision-making process that consumers go through. The decision-making process may vary from person to person. Some people may start with brand, some people may start with category. You know, there's an interesting argument that actually, if your car doesn't belong to a defined category, you may have quite a difficult time of it. If you're like a Volvo XC90, very, very good vehicle according to Clarkson, but you're not a 4x4 and you're not a conventional estate car, the danger is you get completely overlooked in the kind of path dependency of people's decision making. Also look at really, really boring things about human behaviour. Sainsbury's, I've been ranting on for ages saying that people drink too much wine and not enough spirits. Basically because I just prefer drinking spirits. I also think there's a weird British habit of drinking wine without food, which I think is a bit crap. I was IPA president for 2 years. You spent 2 years, standing up at receptions being offered red or white. And without food, I think it's a bit of a rubbish drink. I mean, the French and the Italians don't drink wine on its own. Now, interestingly, one of the reasons why Brits don't drink cocktails or spirits to nearly the extent that Americans do is we don't have any goddamn ice. People don't keep ice in the house, their fridges don't make ice. We generally don't have much or any ice in the home. Now, interestingly, I went on for ages trying to say to Diageo, why don't you just sell ice next to the bloody spirits? Because actually the ice is sold in a completely different part of the shop. Incidentally, if you decide to drink gin and tonic, the lemons and limes are about 4 miles away and against the direction of travel. Now, I know this is a completely banal thing to say, but make it easy to sell. But actually what I discovered, I've been ranting on about this for ages, and I now discovered that Sainsbury's, in conjunction with a couple of spirits manufacturers, have created a cocktail pod in some of their stores, which has all the ingredients you need to make cocktails in one place. I'm assuming including ice. The interesting thing is, since they introduced that, in the stores they introduced that, sales of spirits overall have gone up by 8%. Now, you can't achieve that by advertising, at least not except over years and years and years. So that's the other thing, is just look at what you're doing in terms of simply looking at the context of human behaviour. Now, at certain points in the consumer journey, brands are absolutely vital and they're really, really important. But the fact is that all the brand value in the world isn't going to make you walk 400 yards back to go and buy a lemon. You'll go and buy a bottle of red and a bottle of white like everybody else. So the vital thing to understand is that they're hugely important. They pay back to an astounding degree, but they don't necessarily work in the way you think they work. The biggest way they pay back is that people are happy to pay £2.80 for a Starbucks coffee, whereas they won't pay £2.80 for a coffee they've just bought on Sevenoaks Station. And that's the real way in which brands pay, is that actually we pay a ridiculous premium for the reassurance that brands give. If you want a parallel, actually it's the extended warranty. One of the reasons you can make a fortune selling extended warranties is there's a brief moment of consumer terror when you've just spent 600 quid on an iPad and you're thinking, Jesus, what happens if I drop this, I break it? I'm left with basically a 600 quid brick in my house, feeling like a total idiot for the next 5 years. That thing would sit in my house taunting me. Now, a week before you buy and a week after you buy, you couldn't actually sell this warranty. But at the moment of purchase, fear is absolutely at its maximum. People are basically terrified. Now, what the brand does is actually provide you with reassurance at the moment at which you really, really need it. So quite a lot of the value of a brand doesn't actually turn up in market research, because when you research things, you aren't researching them at the moment of purchase. And if you actually look at brain studies, you look at neuroscience, what you'll see is that people's brains, when they're actually making a real decision with real money, light up in a way that is different to the way they light up if you ask them to make a hypothetical decision. So quite a lot of the value of brands is only really understood by the consumer in that moment of sheer fear, where they're going, shit, this television's 300 quid cheaper, but it might be crap. Okay? Now research, when we're researched, we aren't experiencing that fear. We're making a hypothetical decision, which means that a slightly reduced area of our brain lights up. And in that area, particularly when we're in front of 10 strangers, what we'll say is, well, of course, I look at price and I look at quality. And the whole mechanism of research is, in a sense, forcing people to lie. Because a huge amount of decision-making is contextual. And research, by its very definition, takes place out of context. And what very, very few people will say in market research is basically, well, actually, I go in intending to buy the cheaper one, but at the last minute I will be seized with terror and I will pay £200 more for a recognisable brand. It's pretty much the way they behave.
As usual, Rory said some very, very interesting things. And as usual, when I was listening to him, it made me think, and I hope it made you think too. There were one or two things that started me speculating, and one or two of the things that rang bells with me, and so I asked him about them after he'd finished talking. And I must say, it's very difficult to get this man because he's running around like a lunatic, so I was very pleased to be able to record that interview. One thing that occurred to me that I used to say, in fact I wrote in 1982, was that men fear to lose as much as they hope to gain. And since then, I have discovered that it's not true. I was wrong. In fact, men fear to lose a lot more than they hope to gain. We all talk about benefits, but fear of loss, fear of getting it wrong is incredibly important. The other thing that he said that I was aware of, but I was transferred to a different field, is the fact that, which was discovered by a study by Ehrenberg, and Alex Beale of the Ogilvy Centre for Research, that those who advertise most do best. And I've always said that within the field of direct marketing, if you rely upon direct marketing to a greater degree, I've always said the people who communicate most are the ones who win. End of story, yeah? And if you communicate to people directly, it doesn't have to be a big billboard. I keep on talking to you, saying that I've got something for you and I think it's wonderful, eventually you start to think, this guy is serious, he believes in what he sells. That was another thing that occurred to me. But there were two other things that I wanted to ask Rory about. The first was, does he think that the principles that he's been talking about apply to small businesses as well as large businesses? Because a lot of people associate the word brand with big businesses. They say, oh, you know, Ariel, Chanel,
yeah,
Ford, Mercedes. But I believe that you can build a brand in a little village. I believe that if there are two pubs in a little village, if you go to pub A rather than pub B, it says something about you, which is a different subject I'll be talking about over the next 2 days. So that was one thing I asked him. And the second thing I asked him, which I feel is tremendously important, because the great problem with people in marketing, people who get paid a lot in marketing, is they know nothing about marketing. This is a serious disadvantage. So I also asked him about how much do you need to read to really understand what we're talking about here. So how much do you really need to read to understand what we're talking about here, and does it apply to small businesses as well as large ones?
Two things, I'll answer that in reverse. Small businesses have very, very potent brands. They may not build them through conventional marketing communication, because if you're a village pub, you arguably don't need to. You know, the question is the experience. But the sense that you're dealing with someone who has a long-term interest in their business and is motivated by other than short-term gain is actually absolutely vital at any scale of business. If you want to have a really bad meal, it's really easy. Just go to a tourist area and go to a tourist restaurant. If you go to a tourist restaurant with a great view, you're actually guaranteed the meal will be terrible. And the reason for that is, not completely illogically, those people know they never get repeat business. You know, if you're next to the Eiffel Tower or whatever, you know, no one's ever going to come back every week because the prices you charge are tourist prices, you have no local business, your entire customer base is a one-off transient thing. And so, as a result, you basically charge as much as you can and provide food that's as bad as you can without actually getting prosecuted or killing people. Or if you do kill your customers, you make sure they pay the bill first, you know. And that's in your interest as a tourist restaurant. If you're running a village pub, you're entirely dependent on repeat business, most likely. And therefore, actually, what you will do is you will automatically do all those things that great brands do. You will demonstrate your commitment to, you know, the long term. You won't engage in anything that is sort of short-term profitable at the expense of long-term affection. The opposite of a tourist restaurant, if you like. Now, just an interesting story, just to illustrate how that happened at the level of the smallest business. There was a shop. I used to live in Bayswater, and I walked down about 200 yards to Lancaster Gate tube station to take a tube to work every morning. And pretty much every morning I stopped off and bought a newspaper and sometimes a packet of cigarettes and some other things from exactly the same shop and from exactly the same person. It was a little locally run shop. And after about a year of doing this, one day I left my wallet at home and I was really late for a meeting, so I didn't have time to go back. I looked in my pocket and I was about 50p short, no, actually 20p short of what I needed for the tube fare to get to work. And so I went into the shop and I said, terribly sorry, but I've been coming here for 2 years. Could you just lend me 20p to get the tube today? And they said no. I never went there again. Because I'd been there assuming that I was building up some sort of reputation and interplay between these, you know, between me and them, you know, a relationship of sort of mutual trust of some kind. And they blew the entire thing. Now, that's just an indication. There are, of course, two ways you can make money. You can make money playing the short game, which is the tourist restaurant, get as much money as you can from people. Now, local businesses, it's not very sensible to do this because your reputation keeps you honest, and actually, in any case, you have a limited pool of customers with which to work. So actually, local shops, local restaurants generally do quite a good job of this anyway, which is not to say you couldn't be better. It's not to say you couldn't create, you know, interesting excuses to communicate. Because as Drayton quite rightly said, the person who writes to me a lot is really committed to this game. He really believes in what he's doing, and you know, he's really serious about this stuff. So there's always extra stuff you can do to demonstrate this, but actually quite a lot of local businesses are quite good at it instinctively. Some of them aren't, incidentally, but quite a few of them are good, which is not to say you couldn't be better, just by continually creating a bit more noise and a bit more proof of commitment. As far as reading things go, Drayton's absolutely right. One of the interesting things is that people like Ehrenberg have produced detailed scientific proofs which show the relationship between you know, brands and purchase behaviour and brand leadership. And they show to some extent it follows a pretty mathematical law. There are quite a few other significant books written, not least on behavioural economics. Nudge would be another one. What's interesting is that you, in the world of marketing, and to some extent in the world of advertising as well, you discover that virtually nobody has read any of these books. Now, I don't know what you need to read in order to work as a lawyer. I don't know how much you need to read to work as a doctor, as a surgeon, for example. But what's interesting about marketing is, in truth, to gain 90% of the benefit of extensive reading, you only have to read about 10 or 15 books. You know, Drayton, David Ogilvy, Jeremy Bullmore's very, very good. Actually, I'd recommend just for fun the book of Gossage about Howard Gossage, very, very interesting, eccentric ad man. But I'd read How Brands Grow by Byron Sharp. I'd read a couple of books by Darwinian people, Spent by Geoffrey Miller. I'd read Nudge and actually Persuasion by Cialdini. A very good book incidentally on Price, Priceless by William Poundstone. Now, actually, I could go on and I could list another 10, 20, 30. But actually, if you just read the ones I've just name-checked there, you're already in actually the best read 3% of people working in marketing today. So, in truth, the fact that so few people actually read these things, and actually the effort required so small, is one of the great mysteries of our age.